This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Loaded for speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello one, hello all, and welcome to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. I am so excited to be here with y'all, and with me is my amazing co-host, Jack. How are you doing?
Well, BK, there's no easy way for me to say this. The universe passed me the COVID baton this week for the first time in 2.5 years, so fatigued but enthusiastic, because at least I get to spend COVID talking about and researching an incredible film.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I somehow got you sick over the internet, ? I kid. I'm glad you're feeling better enough to come in here and chat a really good film. And honestly, I couldn't have picked, it's oddly to say, a better film to talk about right now and to talk about with you, because you picked a phenomenal French film for us to watch for this episode.
I chose, as our first foray really into true French cinema, with respect to Fifth Element, I chose 1995's La Haine, written, directed, and edited by Matthieu Kassovitz. And BK, I kind of agonized over this because, you know me, I'm the guy on this podcast who likes to introduce the quirky foreign films, and I struggled with where to jump into France, honestly, because you could start with the New Wave, which is really where French film finds its voice and its basis, but I wanted to look at something that was modern and something that is strikingly relevant to today, something that is as actively important a message in 2022 as it was when it came out. And I can think of few films in any culture that stay relevant the way that La Haine has stayed relevant.
I couldn't have said it better myself, if I'm being honest. I tried to think about a way to compliment it or just say something else, and I go, you know, Jack, you really hit the nail on the head. This is a film that is very relevant to this day. And honestly, I wanted to say ahead of its time, but pretty much its existence was right on time.
It's very much of its time because it talks about modern racial tensions between immigrants and authority in a very intelligent way. The film centers on the aftermath of a riot between police and immigrant youths in the Muguet projects of Paris that are sparked by the beating of a Franco-Arab immigrant in custody. And the film sets its focus on three friends, Vince, Hubert, a Congolese/Zairean immigrant, and Saeed, a Moroccan Arabic immigrant, and their day as they struggle with how to manifest their rebellious angst after this riot, and really to escape their circumstances in their neighborhood while debating what they're going to do if their friend who was beaten by police dies in the hospital. So it's a very potent character portrait of what it's like to be a deprived youth facing off against the police in 90s France.
It's such a very interesting approach to the subject matter as well. I feel like a lot of the time we focus on the what happens in stories about heavy subject matters, especially themes and stories and narratives about police brutality. But what really makes this film stand out is the fact that it is more about the who and who is being affected here. And it really gets into such great character moments and is essentially probably one of the best character studies I've ever seen.
The benefit it has is it adopts a different lens than what we're used to seeing in the context of rioting and uprisings. In most news footage or most archival footage you will see of rioting in any culture, You see it from the perspective of the camera being shot behind the police lines. This film takes the camera and it moves it behind the other group. It shows you the perspective of these kids in the projects, but in doing so, I think one of the real coups of this film is that better than anything really that I've ever seen, it asks the most relevant question of our age, which is how do we get to this point? How do we reach a point in society where there is so much hate and enmity between each other that we kill one another, whether by accident or intentionally? Why are tensions between authorities and underserved populations destined to come to a boiling point? I find it to just be a very complex portrait of both hatred and brutality, not because it shows them in graphic or exploitative ways. It doesn't do that. What it does is it honestly examines hatred as an aspect of who we all are as people. Everyone in the film is humanized, but nobody is let off the hook for the fact that there is the capacity for hate inside of their hearts. And I think on film, to see a representation of hatred and evil like that is not cartoonish or grandiose or somehow removed from moral people's hearts, I think that's exceptionally rare, and it's an interpretation that you cannot take for granted.
I'm so interested that it gravitated towards you that way. I guess I think of hate as something in the negative. And I saw this film as something that approached negatives in a positive way. And I know we'll get into it more when we talk about the themes, but stuff that stood out to me was their concepts of life and the meaning of life and what is it to be and to live in this world that is, and to your point, Jack, full of hate and the violence that surrounds them. There's a lot of conversations and just situations that our main characters go through that bring up, I think, those themes of what constitutes even the very meaning of life. I was like, I did not know we were going to get into something so philosophical when you proposed to watch this movie.
Well, that's French cinema.
Wait, so you mean to be telling me I've been missing out on all of this for this long? Like, hold on, Jack.
That culture is very good, particularly in film, at examining the human condition. It's something that comes from the work of artists like Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut at the cutting edge of the new wave. But I think where it gets taken to a new level in the 90s by people like Kassovitz is that his film is willing to examine France as a modern country and to examine modern tensions of the cultural makeup of the country. Because in the 20th century, as France became a more and more diverse place, the kind of tensions that you see in Haine were really allowed to take hold.
I was going to ask, I'm not a history person, but I have to assume there is a deep-rooted history in the racial tensions in France. I mean, I know how deep it is in America, in the USA. Where does it start? Where does it go back? Like, this is very odd for me to not know this.
Basically, the story starts in the post-World War II period. Europe is in absolute ruins after fighting off the German Nazi menace. And these nations, particularly France, which had been among the most war-torn nations in Western Europe, needed cheap labor to rebuild. And an easy answer was presented in French colonies like Mali and Senegal, where there was a huge reservoir of male labor that could be brought to France for the rebuilding effort at a cheap cost. And that is exactly where French businesses gravitated towards. Really, the story of non-white immigration in France begins in the post-war recovery period. In America, our class divides are primarily down to segregation. Racial classes that were regressed and not allowed to advance at the same rate as white people. And so racial tension manifests very different here than it does over in France, where it's been much more related to class and to where you immigrate from, not just your existence as an immigrant.
I guess I only really have my knowledge from our history of tensions between classes. And I know that it's still prevalent now. So when it's something so deeply rooted, I'm just curious, is it based on their location, where they're from? Is it like France elitism?
Ultimately, these immigrants became demonized not really just because of race, although that certainly plays a way in which the far right in France depicts these people as untrustworthy and through pretty lazy racial stereotypes. But the societal forces that kind of turn France against these African immigrants and gives them a negative view is that as decolonization increased in the 50s and 60s in Africa, the flow of these immigrants rapidly increased into France. And despite the fact that the French went to great efforts to normalize immigration rates with former colonies like Mali, Senegal, and Mauritania, the businesses in France that had gotten used to the cheap labor in the post-war period decided that they were going to ignore those quotas, and they began bringing in immigrants to France illegally. So while in the early 1970s you had 50,000 legal African immigrants in France, you had somewhere between 100 and 200,000 illegal immigrants, and 80% of that population was male. So it became very easy for the French media to begin portraying immigration as a serious social and political issue, in part because of these demographics. And in 1973, this results in a dramatic restriction on the immigration policy.
Wow. Again, you're giving me so much stuff that I didn't know. Like, I feel so ignorant where I'm like, I don't know this much about European history, let alone France history. But then I'm starting to see parallels a little bit. And it always just makes me angry when you see the parallels of hate.
Well, the parallels exist because I think basically the way in which anti-immigrant sentiment has worked around the world in our lifetime certainly is motivated by kind of the same irrational fears. One of the reasons that France dramatically restricted its immigration policy in the early 70s is because there was a world economic recession that was used by interest groups to create a perception of immigrants that were them as threats or competition for the few jobs available in this recession. It also enabled these far-right groups to cast these African immigrant populations as being large enough to be a threat to the public order. This is why you had very few exceptions. Amnesty was given to illegal immigrants very rarely in French immigration policy. And really, BK, a lot of this was also exacerbated by the fact that from the 50s through the 70s, there was an enormous housing crisis within France because the city centers just did not have room for people. And so the only solution was for African immigrants to be put into les banlieues, or their suburbs in France, isolating them from French culture and exacerbating the divides. And BK, I just need to say this off top, suburb has a very different meaning in French culture.
Oh, okay, because I was going to ask, I was like, suburb, that's better than any projects I heard of over here. Let me find out, what does that mean?
To bring it back very quickly to the year 1870, it was at this point in French history where French cities stopped expanding their borders. So instead of, say, Paris adding on new arrondissements and having their city grow in size, new cités or estates were established on the border of major cities, in which a lot of neighborhoods would spark up with low-grade apartment housing in the cities. And these really were the first banlieues that are very reminiscent of the American projects. And moreover, in French society, the divide was further exacerbated because there were classifications of quote-unquote good banlieue, referred to the banlieue easy, or the bad banlieues, referred to as neuilly. And so there was this perception growing in France as this housing crisis was being solved, that there were good suburbs to be in, and then there were the bad suburbs. And that's where the banlieue label really takes over. It becomes representative of this style of neighborhood in the outskirts of French cities where petty crime was on the rise and delinquency was on the rise. These neighborhoods suffered from a lot of the same problems that American projects suffer from. Terrible housing conditions and poor standards, isolation from city centers, rampant drug addiction, and widespread unemployment. It's the tale of underserved neighborhoods around the world.
I hate to be drawing parallels. This sounds like the story that I've heard, the stories that my friends have lived. I feel and I resonate them because I understand what it's like to be in a place and to be limited by the place that you are living in. And when those suburbs are your only options, you really don't have any other choice. That narrative is, I think, explored in the case of one of the main characters in the film.
Oh, it's absolutely discussed, and it's discussed in the context of a time bomb. The film begins with a Molotov cocktail hitting an image of the globe and burning it. And you see that burn and that pyromania reflected in the burning of Hubert's gym at the beginning of the film. And it points to this idea that they are a thing that you have a time limit on getting out from and away from. These kids, even someone like Hubert, who in the film is the sensible character, through his legitimate business is unable to escape. He doesn't get out of there in time, because the neighborhood is content to destroy itself based on the forces that have been unleashed upon it.
I love the time bomb analogy. I wasn't even thinking about that, but you're right. There are ticks throughout the movie. It makes sense. I can't believe I didn't even put that together.
The clock is ticking throughout the film, sort of giving you that indication that the trio is heading for a fall. And that, in kind of macro terms, really does reflect how racially motivated riots began to break out in France, beginning in 1979, which is where this tradition really kind of hails from.
I was going to say, they got a tradition of rioting? That's so metal.
France has always had a tradition of 800 years of, public dissidence, but primarily it's over things like taxation, or the aspirations of nobles, or restrictions on food. But very rarely had it ever been about racial motivations until the late 70s. And it started because of a seemingly isolated incident in a suburb of Lyon, France, called Vaux-en-Velin. And in 1979, police apprehended an injured North African youth in this neighborhood who had been committing some delinquency, but basically was arrested with no concern for his health, was being left to almost bleed to death while in custody. And as a result, when North African youths in this neighborhood heard about this arrest, they responded by rushing to the scene and hurling projectiles at the police. And this event became known as the first of the bavures, which is a French euphemism for the deaths or severe injuries of immigrant youths at the hands of police, a term that infuriatingly literally translates to slip-ups.
I don't like that. That is no. I have been very interested in learning about different groups standing out and advocating for things. And a lot of time that does turn into riots. I know a bit about different causes that are going around globally, but I never knew about it rooted in France.
Well, it roots itself here and in the early 80s because events like this gave the French press the ability to write about who they called the Maghrebin youths, foreigners in the suburbs of French cities who were known for their delinquency, fighting, attacking police, burglary, car thefts, and in particular, a crime that would start popping up more and more in France in the 1980s, pyromania and arson. So there was this sense that was being perpetuated pretty sensationally through the French media that there was a growing problem with gang violence, even though most of these events were disorganized outbursts by the youth. Really, it would be situations where these kids would engage violently with police to prevent the arrest of other delinquents. Similar to the scene we see in Lion where the police are apprehending the guy who fires the shotgun. The moment the police pounce on him, the gang of these youths in the neighborhood rush the police officers and try to grab him from custody and pull him away, even risking their own incarceration to try and save themselves. So it really wasn't an organized thing. It was just kind of an anti-authoritarian sentiment in the early 80s by these delinquents. But because of these efforts being so disorganized but so visceral, French media was able to sensationalize the Maghrebi deaths and foster the belief in the existence of a riot climate in the country by the mid-1980s. So essentially, they're just putting pressure into this powder keg.
Oh, okay, so they're like hyping it up. Because to me, I'm like, there's distinct motives when it comes to gang violence. Honestly, I thought a lot of the time with all the emotions that the characters expressed that it really was people just emotionally lashing out. So to kind of hear that that was taken and the perception was changed to essentially villainize them and make it seem like rioters are going to be out there to get you. It sucks. I feel like a lot of the conversation is so easily lost when they do that.
Well, it's reflected in the film very strongly in the way that Vin, Saeed, and Hubert, our protagonists, react when the camera crew tries to stop them and ask them questions. They tell the crew basically to go screw because it's a reflection of how the media would sensationalize the youth at the time in Paris. Point in fact, in the late 80s, most of the organized resistance to the bavures, these little quote-unquote slip-ups by police, were very peaceful and organized demonstrations. And yet, because the media saw the glitz and glamour side of glorifying rioting and violence, that's where the riot climate stuff really creeps in. So it was a situation where the forces in society that were dictating the conversation were loading up this racial powder keg that by the early 90s was ready to absolutely explode. And that explosion finally happens during the first week of October in 1990.
What happened in 1990?
On October 6th, 1990, during a pursuit of a couple of joyriders, the police swerved their vehicle into 21-year-old Thomas Claudio while he was a passenger on a motorbike. And he died minutes after the crash, BK.
Wait, was it like he was speeding? They just ran into the motorcycle to shut it down?
As with a lot of these cases involving Maghrebin youth being injured or killed by police, there is a significant amount of dispute on the circumstances. But the one thing that remains certain is that there was a strict tension at the time between the police and between these delinquents. And so whether Thomas Claudio did something to incite this police violence, or if the police just saw a youth they didn't like the look of and deliberately swerved, we will never know. But what we do know is that the following day on October 7th, the Maghrebin youth in the Vaux-en-Velin neighborhood where this happened decided that they were going to coordinate their first ever riot. So at 3 p.m. that day, a shotgun blast goes up on the high street of the Cité, and a series of violent attacks are incited at the same time. A car is ram-raided into the front of the shop. Several locations around the neighborhood are burned. And a genuine organized race riot breaks out with hundreds participating in looting and violence. And when police and fire brigades attempted to put out the fires and restore public order, they were attacked in very coordinated ways with stones.
I guess I hear what you say. Maybe we don't really know, and I don't think anyone deserves to get ran over by a car. So it's fascinating to me that that's the option they chose. I would be in uproar, especially if tensions were already building and, like you said, the power keg was getting full. At this point, then, why hold back? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's so interesting to be able to really think about the perspective of these kids out there on the streets, or youths, as we like to say.
Both sides in this story are kind of stuck at this point. Really, this whole sensationalization of the riot climate in the 1980s and the escalation of more and more bavures happening every year during this period, it really hardened the prejudices among all segments of French society concerning that culture. The media sensationalism and the preconceived notions basically blow all future killings of Maghrebin youths out of proportion from this point. And it becomes what is known in France as the bavure riot cycle. It is this expectation that existed in France during the 90s that every time a Maghrebin youth, whether they were escaping police as innocents or if they had committed a crime and they were killed by police, that when that death of a Maghrebin youth happened, it would result in a large-scale organized riot against the police and against authority. This was most graphically seen in the events around the killing of Mohamed Bari in October 1992, where after he had been killed escaping police with a stolen car, the youths responded by surrounding the Vaux-en-Velin police station and burning it to the ground in the first targeted attack ever on police infrastructure by these delinquents.
Wow, I did not know it escalated like that. I mean, that's 3 years for people to get brazy enough to be like, after this time, we can't just do something small anymore. I'm trying to get into their minds and understand the motives here. I want to know, does it ever come to an end, or is it just really even more? Does it get worse than that?
There is no real check on police conduct at this time for these bavures. It was an entrenched institution by the 1990s, and there were a lot of really duplicitous and sickening practices within these departments that were, despite the murders of these Maghrebin youths, not checked, in part because these Maghrebi were so disregarded and reviled by proper French society. You don't have a lot of progress after you have over 300 killings between 1979 and 1993. But really, where La Haine comes into this picture is in April of 1993, when the police murder 17-year-old Zairean immigrant Makome Umbowale in police custody. Just a trigger warning both for you, BK, and for our audience. This is a graphic story of police murder.
Yes, I'm really glad you said that there. So if you do need to take the time, skip ahead. We won't be talking too much about the incident itself, and we'll be getting into more about the story and the creation production of the film that we are into. But we would be remiss if we did not bring up the events that have happened here and really are very, very shocking.
On April 5th, 1993, the police arrested Umbowale and 2 of his friends for stealing Dunhill cigarettes. And that night, his 2 friends were released because they were able to get in touch with their parents. But Umbowale's guardians were out of contact, so over the night, he was chained to a radiator, and at different times during this period, he was beaten to elicit a confession. The details around here, like with all baveurs, get murky. During this period of intimidation on the morning of April the 6th, Officer Pascal Compin pulled out his gun to intimidate Umbowale, pressing the gun against his temple. And whether it was deliberate or accidental, the gun goes off and he was shot in the head and killed instantly.
It is heavy stuff. And I'm glad that you said that at the end there too, whether it was accidental or intentional. Quite frankly, I think a lot of people will agree with me is that it doesn't matter and it shouldn't have gotten to that point. And I think that right there is definitely what would spark, I think, immediate protest, in my opinion, because cigarettes, Jack, cigarettes.
It's a story that's far too common.
So too common, yeah.
But it did spark immediate anger in the French public, in part because it was a string of 3 bavures by police in a 4-day span. And so, on April 6, 1993, cut to our director of La Haine, Matthieu Kassovitz, driving through Paris when the report of Umbowale's murder comes over the radio. Kassovitz, in that moment, was so angered by what he heard that he parked his car, turned it off, got out, and went to join the protesters and the rioters basically from the moment he heard the news item. And that night when he got home, he sat down and started to write La Haine.
That's what I'm talking about. That's a creative right there. I'm fueled by that motivation, that action, the no hesitation. And then to go, I need this story to be told for others to see. That is awesome.
Kassovitz is a really interesting guy. He himself is the son of a Hungarian immigrant, the TV director Peter Kassovitz, who y'all might know for directing the 1999 Robin Williams film Jacob the Liar. But Kassovitz was raised essentially as a first-generation Frenchman, raised in a Jewish household. And he grew up, because of his father and the fact that his mother was an editor, being in films as an actor from a young age. But beyond this artistic grounding, as a teenager, he would get involved in the 80s in the b-boy scene in France, which meant he was spending most of his teens in the banlieues of Paris.
So he was, as we like to say, out here in these streets. That's really funny, though, to find out at the b-boy scene. Like, they was top rocking and doing all that stuff. Like, that's awesome to know that it's traveled through France and that it's in more locations than I realized.
Oh, it was a huge influence on France. I mean, point in fact, it's through the b-boy scene where Matthieu Kassovitz met Vincent Cassel, met Saïd Taghmaoui. So he was building connections with the teens in the banlieues of Paris, and he was gaining a perspective as a filmmaker and as an artist that was not closed off in high French society, that was not removed from the racial tensions that were around him. He was just so involved in the situation and has remained militant and anti-racist to this day. So the motivations for creating this film come out of knowing these kids, of knowing these people, and of being friends with them.
I am so fascinated to hear that, because the more you have context of that when you watch the film, honestly, there are times where I have felt as if it is filmed with the intention to be a fly on the wall. There aren't a lot of those scenes where it is overtly cinematic or makes it feel like, you know, you're watching something over the top. It does feel like a lack of a better term, a slice of life of those areas and being able to kind of be there. There's so many scenes, especially in the early setup, where they're going to the rooftop and hanging out on the block and the police interaction that ensues afterwards. The film shows so much without saying it. And I feel like that's a testament to his experience and his desire to even tell this story, especially finding out that this is where he used to be.
I love that you call it fly on the wall, because I think that says something very important about what the real perspective is. He said very clearly on making this film that one of his motivations is that he wanted to use cinema to show people like his father what was happening in the projects and what his friends were going through. Kassovitz has said that this isn't the story of these kids in the projects. This is, viewing the projects. This is a movie that needs to be seen by the middle classes and the upper classes in France, because it is a viewpoint of showing them what this life is like, to motivate them, hopefully, to engage with the kids and the immigrants in these neighborhoods, to learn more about them. So it wasn't a project that was just born out of his despair over Imbole's murder. Kassovitz, beyond just those injustices, had a motivation of wanting to show these people as human beings, as well-rounded people who were capable of joking with each other, clowning with each other, having difficult conversations with one another, making sure that these kids in the projects were not a pejorative in the way that they were depicted.
He does such a good job at it too, though. That commentary, I could feel it. The film exuded it. The one thing that this movie does well is really show off its themes and tell a real down-to-earth story. From the moment we get into the film, I'm immediately immersed in these kids' way of life. And it's done through not just some really awesome subtle film techniques, but really through, I think, the attention to the subject matter at hand and the care, and to hear the motivations of trying to be able to tell a story for very own father to understand. It makes a lot of sense for why it's even constructed the way it is. I mean, the whole movie feels like it is one continuous movement of time. And for me, that is such a very important feeling to convey, because when you're dealing with heightened emotions, you never escape the feeling or the momentum, and that every moment counts. It is a endless flowing reality that you have to be a part of. There are no beats. I feel like the whole film is always in constant motion, even when there are slight moments of rest. It is so well done, Jack.
It's very well drawn in that way, in that it doesn't let you breathe or take a break from the world of this trio of Vince, Hubert, and Saeed as they go through their day. And I think kind of the brilliance of that is that it makes you identify with and love them at a strong degree that is hard to access in a lot of films. But I think a lot of that is benefited from the fact that these guys were all friends of Matthieu Kassovitz's before they began. Vincent Cassel was in the same b-boy scene. His younger brother, Matthias, was the founder of French hip-hop group Assassin, which, along with their rivals, NTM, provided the diegetic music for this film. Hubert was an actor who had gone opposite Kassovitz in the 1993 film Matisse. And Saeed grew up poor in the banlieue and was a son of Moroccan immigrant parents. The fact that they all had this experience of being in these neighborhoods, the fact that they all were friends and understood where each was trying to come from in their artistic vision of constructing this film, I think gave them the ability to really build this world in that aggressively tense, engrossing way that you cannot escape. And part of that too, I think, beyond just the youthful motivation of a core of this project that was all in their 20s, I think it comes down to the fact that Vince, Hubert, and Saeed all are drawn from very different cloth and have very different motivations throughout the film.
I can't believe I didn't put their names together. That should have been a given, that their character names are their actual names. It all makes sense. This is clearly a grassroots project. So I've got to ask, the creation of this, it has to have been very low budget, no?
Beyond low budget, BK, this was basically guerrilla filmmaking. They did not have the money for color film, so they decided to go with black and white, both for budget constraints and because it helped Kassovitz keep the focus in the film on the subjects. They were a guerrilla crew. They were 12 people and one van. They were scouting for locations based on luminance because they needed to get natural light. They worked with very, very few camera setups because they just didn't have the time to do 15 setups of one scene. And as a result, it becomes a film where the blocking and the movement of the actors within the frame is very complex and very necessary for the artistry of the film. But it's worth mentioning, BK, none of this guerrilla filmmaking that they were doing in the Les Muguets banlieue would have been possible if they had not taken the trouble to build up respect with the community beforehand.
I was going to ask, you can't just pull up on a block and start rolling cameras. You know what I'm saying? You don't just do that. You had to have had some sort of rapport with people there.
Skepticism would have been natural in the banlieue. Are these guys cops? Are they journalists who are trying to exploit the neighborhood? So Kassovitz solved this problem by renting an apartment in the banlieue for 3 months so that he and the principals could workshop the film and gain acceptance from everybody there. These guys were walking around the neighborhood, talking with different groups of people, building on the slang that existed in the neighborhood and learning it for themselves, and really working in a very communal way to build up broad approval from the people that they were depicting within the film. And in large part, they were successful in Les Muguets.
I love that. That makes me love this even more, to know that, one, just out of respect is so cool, but two, as someone who is a creative, that's exactly the type of creative study and experience and dedication that I would want, especially when telling a story that is so integral to telling the true message and give the real vision of the people they're talking about. I love that. This is sick.
Despite the fact that they had that acceptance, don't let that confuse you into thinking that this was an easy project to make guerrilla style. They still had to use, in some cases, long focal lengths and long lenses because it enabled them to shoot the characters from far away and to hide the camera if necessary.
Wow. I didn't even realize that. I thought, oh, well, maybe it was stylistic. It also makes sense out of respect. You're not trying to show too much. You got to be fair and respectful.
Respect was really the name of the game in a lot of aspects of how this was made, including how they got the rights to Bob Marley's music for the intro of the film. Now, do you know this story, BK?
I didn't know this story, but I did know how important the music choice was for this film. This was something where it needed to be authentic to the space. So I think that was the first thing that stood out to me when I was watching the film, is that it was fairly quiet and that there wasn't a lot of music except for that intro. So I'm fascinated to hear what this story is.
You're dead on about the intro being different, and that was a conscious choice because Kassovitz wanted the film to be as honest to the feel of the banlieue as possible. And you know this if you've ever been anywhere near an American project. You're getting music out of an open window from a 5th floor. You're getting music from a boombox out on the court. It doesn't come from non-diegetic sources. The sounds of the project and the music of the projects comes from the people of the projects. And that was important throughout the film. But to use Bob Marley, it was part of creating the sentiment and the feel of these riots, and it needed to be an honest reflection of the struggle in montage over the opening credits. So to get the rights to this Bob Marley song for this crucial opening sequence, Kassovitz at the time had to contact Bob Marley's family to get the song. So the way he did it is he sent them the fully edited opening credit sequence with the riots, with Marley's music already edited in. And when Marley's family saw what Kassovitz was depicting, they almost immediately approved the scene.
Really? Just like no hesitation. They were like, yep, this is it. We love it.
From the way that Kassovitz tells the story, it's pretty much how it went down. It speaks to the care that went into making this project. And you see that care as well with some just unbelievably revolutionary shots that they did in this.
Oh my God, yeah. We can talk about one of the shots that I love that I don't know if you know what happens there, but it's like the best scene in the film for me. It's a mirror scene. Vince, main guy, is reacting like a famous scene from a film I haven't seen before.
Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver from 1976, the very famous "You Talking to Me" scene.
Oh, okay, so it is that scene. Okay, I'm not crazy. Also, I'm sure half of our community is rolling over right now at the fact that I haven't seen that, and we might need to rectify that. But in that scene, Vince is looking into a mirror and is talking back to him. And honestly, when we talk about how low budget is, and you think about a lot of the techniques that can use to remove cameras, that is like green screen stuff. And when you're making budget cuts to like use black and white shooting, I don't think we were having the budget for special effects. So what actually happens in that scene is it is not a mirror, it is a window, and it is a body double there, Jack. So the back of the head is not Vince, and Vince is inside, and you're recording his face, making sure not to show the body double's face there. And then they cut seamlessly to the other side, essentially. So it's a really, really cool trick and such a great scene to kind of bring you into his story. It really kind of sets the pace once we see that scene and things really start to keep going.
I did not know they used a body double there. Can I just say that's like one of the best body doubles I've ever seen in film?
Yeah, it is. We use that technique a lot in film, but the problem that people face a lot of time is it's human error. You really have to sync up and practice those improv mirror warm-ups that I remember from theater, being a theater kid. And it's pretty awesome when it's that good because you would never know. You literally think you're looking into a mirror. It is an amazing scene. And super intentional. Every scene in this film has purpose. Even the scenes that I thought maybe were dragging out or I was struggling to find the purpose or the intent of the scene. After watching it the first time, like we got off and I had to watch the ending again because I was like, holy crap, that was so much to digest. And then two, kind of like re-skim through some of the earlier scenes because there was definitely context that I think I was missing that was being shown to me rather than being told to me.
I think that's a really key thing that this film does to set you in the mind of our three protagonists. Visuals are used to really make you feel like they are sharing your headspace. I mean, when we're introduced to Hubert in the burned out gym when he's punching at the heavy bag, it is not him telling us how angry he is about the fact that his gym has been burned down. You see the conflict and the struggle with him as Saeed and Vince watch him go through the fury of working out his aggression. Vince, you learn he's a tough guy, not because of the fact that he does anything in the riot that you are shown explicitly, but because you see him as this goofy, shit-talking kid who has this sense of self-aggrandizement. You get the sense of Saeed as a social butterfly, not because of anything that he says, but because you see him float around groups doing that, like almost like that little kid tugging on his older brother's shirt kind of attitude throughout the film. And it allows you just to focus back in on these three. It allows you to see them as three very differently drawn people and unique members of this friend group.
I'm so happy you brought that up because that is so important. And I think once those stories get delved into more throughout the film is when I really started gravitating towards the characters because I guess to the film's credit, I quite frankly didn't really like them at the beginning. I didn't like it. I was like, what is this? This is the guy? Come on. You know what I mean? And as I started getting introduced to the friend group and learning more about each character's difference, but also shared experience, it really starts to bring you in to their lives. And not only their lives, though, but their struggle with the world that they live in outside of the imminent, oh, we need to act. We want to send a message. Our friend is in a coma. We don't know if he'll live or die. And we want reparations. We want something. An eye for an eye is a weird idiom that I feel like was so prevalent and kind of challenging that notion from all of these characters on whether or not that's the right decision, whether or not to do something of that nature, but also the willingness to stand up and to fight for what is right and kind of be free and exist. There's just so much depth to these characters. I feel like I could go on and on about each one. Hubert is like, my God, I was rooting for him, Jack, throughout the whole film. So you can understand how I got for the ending.
And I think one of the things, honestly, that makes them such an interesting friend group is that each of them kind of has a different motivation or journey through the film of what they're looking for. But all of these journeys are motivated by the pressure of and the time bomb nature of the banlieue. I would say when you talk about wanting reprisals and wanting to get even, wanting to exercise a certain amount of power over this situation with their friend Abdel in which they feel powerless, that to me seems a lot like Vince's journey. Of all three of them, I feel like Vince has the most close relationship with his struggle over his own pride. He starts off in the film bragging about the fact how in the night previous, he has managed to steal this gun off of a police officer. But this access to this gun, it makes him go on this flight of fancy throughout the film where he's jazzed up about the feelings of power that he has. And he's desperate throughout the film, is Vince, to seem in control and to seem empowered. But when he has the actual chance to use that gun, both in the Russian roulette scene in the guy's apartment in Paris, as well as his opportunity to shoot the skinhead, the guy that really deserves it, he actually reveals that he is scared of that power, and that taking that fatal leap into being too prideful is something that he really does not want to make. And in that moment when he fails to kill the skinhead towards the end of the film, you see Vince in this struggle for power that he just wants to float above the problems of the neighborhood just like the others. And he has to be the one out of all of them to make the most active choice to not be defined by the delinquency in the banlieue, even if it means sacrificing his feelings of power.
I'm so interested that you saw it that way. I don't disagree. I think that makes perfect sense. For me, I guess I was interested in Vince's story, and his story was great relevance, but to me, it all set up for Hubert and his story as being the sensible one and being the one who is constantly trying to tell Vince to not use the gun, and even approaching to him on a different level, at his level of, I don't want to say morals, but the standards of the streets, where it was, we're willing to do these violent things and violent acts. So, I mean, they break the law quite often. So killing someone wasn't a big deal. We talk about getting stripes and like doing time as if it was a badge of honor. For me, I thought the story that connected with me and just stood out so strong was Hubert's descent back into the madness, where he ends up being the one with that very power, being with that gun, and being in, I think, the worst and most difficult situation. He is constantly trying to like egg even Vince on, get him to be the one to shoot, to be like, hey, if you're going to shoot anyone, shoot someone that deserves it. He's right here. It's right now. You keep talking about you wanting to shoot a cop this whole time to make a point. Are you even going to make a point? What are you going to do? Kill them all? Like, we all know that's not going to happen. And what will it be for? Vince hears that message finally at that last time, to the point where he gives up the gun to Hubert. And then when you think Vince has kind of received his innocence back, you have his life taken away right in front of him. Those plays of the innocence and the power and loss of innocence is so strong to me, because we have Hubert and Saeed kind of presenting as a more innocent people compared to Vince. And then Vince becoming innocent again. And then you have Saeed as the only last innocence there, who's there to witness it all. What will he do? What is the outcome? It all kind of culminates to really just a commentary of their life of constant flux. And a lot of the quotes in some of the VO that said at the beginning and the end of the film of talking about their state of what I would say life being chaos, or in Buddhist terms, understanding impermanence, and how there is no future for these kids, especially kids from the streets and kids from the projects. What do you do? How do you live by yourself? And that type of, mentality really defines you. And it's a very higher level of thinking, which just fascinated me. I did not think I was going to walk into a story, Jack, and be hit with that higher level of a thinking and looking at characters who are typically depicted with the lowest level of comprehension.
I think one thing that you're hitting at in your analysis there that is crucial to understanding these three characters is that their ends of the film are all tragic for very different reasons. You mentioned Vince losing his life after sort of gaining his innocence back. I don't know if I necessarily think it's that. I think in a way he has still lost his innocence, but I think he's wise at that point to the fact that he cannot change the world. And so it makes his death all the more tragic that he is killed in a bavure. He's killed in an accident. And even though he dismisses his pride, he ends up dead through a mistake. But then you mention Hubert's journey and descent back into delinquency. And I think that's a very different framing of tragedy, because I've mentioned the burned out gym where we meet him at the beginning of the film that he had owned. You're meeting Hubert at a point where all he's wanted to do is escape from the banlieue, and yet This film starts with it being too late for him. He's not going to get out. He starts out, when Vince is glorifying the idea of doing time, he very blithely tells him, I've never done any time, and just throws the sensibilities of the streets back in Vince's face. But the more that Hubert realizes that he is going to be othered by society because of where he comes from, whether it's the police using the hash he has on him as an excuse to arrest him and Saeed and brutally abuse them, whether it is the art gallery they go to where the high society of France regards them as hooligans and they all revert to that attitude to sort of give these people the worst version of themselves. You see, Hubert's tragedy is that his inability to escape has led him back to the ethos of the streets. And so at the end, when Vince is killed in the bavure, of course Hubert is going to pick up the gun and shoot the police officer and get himself killed in the process, because he has been unable to escape the violence and the ethics that has been a disease that has followed him around his entire life. And so the tragedy of Hubert is that he falls into the very things that Vince almost escaped.
Oh my God, that's so well put. And then to my point of the constant cycle, we come to the end, which is the very similar homage to the start. Saeed there with his eyes closed, really putting you, the viewer, back in the role of the person and the lens of that character, and really trying to accept that reality. I mean, that's the first thing you do when you see something, when you can't believe your eyes, something that you can't accept. And I feel like a universal visual representation of that is that eye blinking that Saeed does there. And it's just such a powerful way to end the film on the character that, again, Saeed has played a very back burner side character. He is very secondary compared to Hubert being Vince's foil throughout a lot of the film, even though he has so much importance for a lot of the situations that do happen to him. So it's nice at the end there for them to remind you that no. Saeed was a character too, and quite frankly, might have the harshest reality to deal with out of them all.
At the end of this film, I think I feel more sorry for Saeed than anybody else that's in the film. Saeed, throughout, he does operate kind of in a secondary capacity because he's not one of these two foils, but I think he's actually the most important guy in the friend group because he is that glue in every situation that wants to find peace and camaraderie. When they get run into the police station early in the film, he's the guy that's talking to the Arabic police officer, that's trying to create a dialogue to draw an understanding of where they're coming from with the police. He's the guy that's trying to go to the other groups hanging out on the rooftop and get the updates on the neighborhood, trying to be that unifying force. And so Saeed's tragedy, to me, is really about the fact that he fails to be able to draw people together in a peaceful way. For all his efforts in the film to find a better way of conducting himself, to live through his circumstances with an understanding of impermanence and that the meaning of life is being in the present, he ends up failing at that because the circumstances around him are a powder keg that are out of his control.
I'm glad you're articulating it that way as well, because I feel like my emotions they're so connected to each of the characters and really what they meant to me and what stood out to me. And I kind of expressed my experience. I didn't really care for Saeed or Sense, but the more I learned about the characters, learned about the group, I wholeheartedly agree with you. He is the glue. He was the first person to try to calm the tensions between the two of them, to get them to do things, to try to live in the life and try to stop worrying about that or stop worrying about this. Just be and have fun. I think he's honestly our close to innocence view of the situation. So it does hurt. And I think he does have the most tragic ending there when we get to the end. And it is so sad, I guess, to just think about the reality of what this film represents, that it is a very realistic take. As much as it is fiction, it isn't, Jack. It isn't at all.
No, it's not a fiction because it deals, I think, with some themes that are real flashpoints for cultural discussions even today. Power-breeding violence is an extraordinarily strong theme throughout this script. The more that these guys struggle with the concept of control in their own lives and struggle with the impermanence of being, the more desperate, particularly Vince, becomes about seizing that power and using that violence as a way of legitimizing the way that they feel. And that's where we get back to what I talked about up top, is that that's the hatred that exists within our trio that they have to reconcile with, this relationship they have with power and violence.
It is such a delicate situation as well. And I think it's just a very unfortunate thing you have to kind of deal with in the human condition. And to have a film that really like bridges that subject in such a strong and tactful manner, I think gets very high praise in my book, Jack.
And not only that, it does a brilliant job of juxtaposing something that we all deal with as people, which I think is the dichotomy between presentation of who you are versus reality. This trio, throughout the film and through their discussions, a lot of which are just comedic, it's just a group of friends shooting the shit and being friends with each other. And they reveal themselves in these interactions to be extremely complex, deep people, capable of complex thought, capable of having an inner life that humanizes them to the audience. Yet, when you see how they're treated by, again, high society and authority, as well as how they react to those people, you see that they're stuck in a world of pejorative labels. Every moment in this film, you see the othering happen between these different diasporas of society, and you see the space where that hate and enmity between groups grows. But it also shows you through this trio that there's a solidarity that is also developed in the way that these people are isolated. There's an understanding that they have of each other that they don't feel they owe to anybody else. And it's a debate whether or not we owe each other that in society. Do we have to explain ourselves to one another? Or should we just be accepted as well-rounded human beings off top? It raises big questions about how you surmount that barrier.
I have to say, I think it's pretty obvious that this film has impacted both of us immensely and emotionally, and I think arguably spiritually, ? I'm curious to know, how did it impact its own people? I mean, it is representing a very specific culture and a very specific community. Was it positively received? Because it sounds like production-wise, it was.
Well, production-wise, it was received well by the people that were in this community in Les Muguets. But BK, when this film comes out, it became a controversial artistic statement within mid-90s France. It has had a long-lasting effect as a cult classic around the world, but it is in France where it had its most dramatic and shocking impacts.
I had hoped so, I guess. This film moved me. And I feel like even if you were, quote unquote, on the other side, I don't think that this film villainized or really depicted cops in a negative light. I think it was, again, the reality of the situation. And as you pointed it out earlier, too, how our kids from the streets, they really act delinquent. I hate that word, but it is the best word to describe how they behave. I mean, you wouldn't catch people talking back to the cops like that in certain areas. So, like, it's a very interesting and unique experience to have to deal with that. And I think that the film really presented a good lens. So I hope people were dramatically impacted like this. Did it win awards? How did it even exist in the West? Like, how did I get a chance to be able to see? I mean, it's a French film.
Well, the controversy around it really starts at its reception at the Cannes Film Festival in 1995. Kassovitz, first off, at the festival, he wins Best Director and Best Editor for this effort, so it was widely respected in critical circles, and in fact, it received a standing ovation at the screening as one of the most beloved films in that year's festival. But when it came time for the celebratory parade of the films and filmmakers at the festival, as the La Haine crew and cast came onto the parade, the police officers en masse turned their backs on the filmmaking team because they saw it as a way of hatefully responding to a film that they believed was hateful towards them.
No way. I mean, I guess, I'm not police, so I can't really speak for them, but yeah, you coming in with already existing baggage and then seeing a movie like that where it is very unbashing of what it happens. It's a very frank film. Some people are not equipped to handle such an emotional journey that this film presents. So that's so crappy to hear.
Well, it wasn't helped either by the fact that a couple of weeks after its release, it would become the subject of a lot of discussion among political circles because of the fact that on June 8th and 9th, literally about 2 weeks after it came out, Belkacem Belhabib, a Maghrebian youth, was killed being pursued by police in the Bouteverte banlieue. And this sparked more days of rioting and violence. And the film, having just come out, was seized upon by arch-conservatives and fascists like Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the French fascist movement in the 90s and early 2000s, to blame La Haine for the violence. And in part, it had to be really strongly rebuffed by moderates and the left in France, because this trend, as we've discussed in our history section of the podcast, had existed long before. As French sociologist Francois Dubé put it, the banlieue kids did not wait for La Haine to express themselves.
Yeah, that's crazy for them to think that this movie is what made this happen. It's been happening for years. Literally for the last 5 years, you're looking outside and this is transpiring. You mean to tell me you think this movie that came out made it happen? No, y'all need to cut it out.
But there is a separate tragedy in here, I think, because Kassovitz made this film in part because he wanted people to see what the experience of these banlieue was like, so that he could get people to go to these neighborhoods and talk to these people. But when the film comes out, unfortunately, the media and the French politicians in power at the time focused on Kassovitz and his film instead. Jacques Chirac sent a letter to Kassovitz thanking him for shedding light on the social issues. Prime Minister Alain Juppé, who was known for being very conservative, asked to screen the film for French government officials, to which Matthieu Kassovitz said, you know, that's wonderful, but I'm not going to be there because I think this is all, his words, bullshit. What it comes down to is he just kept being asked these questions about what's going on in these neighborhoods, and he just said, don't ask me that. Go to the banlieues and ask the guys there. But he couldn't get interest in doing that. And to this day, Kassovitz, as a guy who is militant, as a guy who understands and believes very strongly that French riot police are racist in the way that they interact with rioters, he bemoans the fact that he is kind of the guy that when there is unrest in France, he's the one journalists are flocking to for comment. It's a story that he wanted to tell to build perspective, and the fact that he still butts heads with that to this day is a bit of a curse. He's very blessed, I think, to have done a film like this, but he's not been able to raise the awareness he would like to, and I think that's a shame.
I can understand how disappointing that can be, especially when you make something that has such a great commentary. So to have your work spark great conversation, but again, enact no change, or not even the conversation that is wanting to be had. I mean, sounds like they're interested, but if you're interested enough, you need to go there and see, because if you see with your own eyes, then you'll know. And I think that's a very strong message to stand by, especially as a creator from your work, where in this day and age, you are very much judged and defined on what you put out into the world. So I kind of have big props for him and kind of standing by how he feels about it. And I'm pretty sure that it is a curse now that you mention it, because it's probably one of those things where he can't escape. They'll be like, hey, yo, so like, what's it like? Bro, don't ask me that. Just please, for the love of God, don't ask me. All right.
But with all the baggage that French society had put on this film, I think the reason people come back to this through all of the controversies, through all of the messages, is because in a way it's just a likable, fun film through all the hatred that it shows. It's something that you get to see these people as human, and you get to see their friendship as real. And I think the value to that is that you cannot for 1 second ignore the trio that our film focuses on as real people with a real struggle about them. I said it off top that it's rare to see an examination of human emotion and of hatred the way that this film does it, but I think you're right in what you said, that it does examine negative aspects of society positively. It gives you an opportunity to see unfettered human emotion depicted on the screen in a way that has a resonance to the world around us. It doesn't leave our immigrant guys here isolated from society. It shows how much they and their plight is a reflection of the society of which they are a part, and how they are inextricable members of that society. And I think that's the message that if you've ever been lucky enough to have your life enriched by people who come from all different walks of life, all different economic classes, all different diaspora, it's something that you feel is dramatically true, and it makes this film feel as honest as it is. I just think in terms of those conveyances of humanity, it is just a dramatically important film.
Dramatically important. That means it's got to be on your must-watch list, because quite frankly, if you're into dramas, you're going to absolutely love this. But if you're not, which is someone like me, but you are into film and you want to experience a very captivating story, I highly recommend this. This film definitely, it opened my mind to not only the story and the history about stuff I didn't know about, it really kind of exposed me to a different sort of filmmaking and how to digest that media. I can't explain to you how it is filmed with the vibe that it is. Like, you have to watch it to get what I mean when I say this. But like, this, I think, has refined my palate, this film right here.
As somebody who does love high concept film and high art from around the world, that's all I can ask for, honestly. This is proof positive right here of why we do this podcast, because it's not just about celebrating the old favorites that we love and having strong arguments about why we love those old classics, but it's about smaller films that people may not necessarily have seen over in the United States or have seen in their film experience and their film culture, because there is so much art from so many different sources that has so much to say. That is the beauty of any art form, let alone the 20th century's defining art form in film. So to know that I may have opened up a new access point for you, total success of an episode. Total success.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. No, I genuinely enjoyed it. And it is definitely connected with me on a level I wasn't anticipating. So you've gotten some extra passes in your book for recommendations. Some very large benefits of the doubts the next time you suggest something to me, because this was smashing, Jack.
We don't need the benefit of the doubt, I don't think, next week, because you have picked something for us that is, I think, near and dear to both of our inner child.
Yes. I am actually very excited to tee up the film we're getting into for the next episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds, and that is the iconic Jumanji. Yes, that's right.
Let's clarify for everybody, because I know there were some remakes, but we're talking about the Robin Williams 1995 version. We're sticking in the year of 1995 for 2 weeks.
Oh my gosh, you're right. We should clarify. In my mind, Jack, there's only one Jumanji. But we are going to get into all the things. You know, your girl is a big fan of practical effects, and this film is chock full of them, plus a very cool story involving time skips. Any youngins who are listening to us, you need to get on this so you can be able to join in on the conversation. And any old heads, we are going to blow your mind open with all of the BTS deets that you probably don't know about the amazing 1995 film Jumanji.
Honestly, I think that family focus is an interesting part of it too, because it is one of the most well-drawn family films, I think, of all time. Yeah, you get plenty of action and plenty of adventure, but it is drawn in a way that is accessible for everybody at every age. And I think that that's something, as we examine it next week, is going to become a clear part of why it is such a genius film.
Yes. And I cannot wait. And I'm very excited to also tee up that we will be having some watch parties still, even though the horror season is over. We are still trying to open up the community every time we get a good chance and a good film in the rotation. And I think, Jack, you might want to lay up this upcoming watch party, because I've never heard of it.
We're going to be watching Jumanji before this episode of Haine comes out, but the Sunday after this episode, we are going to be taking on, before our Thanksgiving break, one of the seminal comedies of all time. So we've got Life of Brian coming up.
And Q, people excited. Q, BK confused. I heard it's supposed to be funny, so I'm very excited to see what that means. The community is thrilled for me to experience my first, again, Monty Python.
There are a lot of people who literally just audibly screamed when you couldn't finish that name.
Well, I can't wait to broaden my horizons. Partly one of the major reasons I personally love doing this podcast is getting to learn and find out about films that Jack likes and testing my limits and seeing what I like. So I'm very excited to get into that. So if you want any details on when we're doing watch parties of that nature and when the next ones are coming up, be sure to follow us on Twitter at RFN_podcast, as well as Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. We're working on trying to expand to some other platforms in the world of the interwebs, so be on the lookout for that. But until next time, I think that's it for us, Jack.
I believe so. Hey, and as far as this season, jusqu'ici tout va bien. So far, so good.
Wait a second, isn't that foreboding?
Jusqu'ici tout va bien. No, I can't say it. I can't. I've lost it. I had it once, BK, and I finally took me the whole recording, but I finally screwed up some French. I think I'm gonna have to make that it for myself on that note. Have a great week, everybody. We will see you back here with Jumanji.
See you next time.